All right, so could you just give us a rough summary of the events of Iran-Contra?
Yeah, sure. So basically what happened was the Iranians took a bunch of Americans hostage at the American embassy. They were also doing that in other places of the world. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected over Jimmy Carter because the economy was in shambles, and like I said, countries like Iran were running roughshod, taking Americans hostage, and it seemed like there was nothing we could do about it. So we elected Ronald Reagan. The day he was brought into office, the Iranians released all the hostages that they held at the embassy. They were scared of this guy because this guy meant business. He kind of came in and he was a bit of a quote-unquote cowboy, and he scared our enemies. So they let the hostages go, and in other places of the world, they were grabbing hostages, French hostages, European hostages. They grabbed some American hostages. At the same time, they were fighting Iraq, okay? And you know from Iraq, the guy running Iraq was a guy named Saddam Hussein, who was around and in power until we took him out a few years ago under George Bush. So Iran was fighting Iraq. They were both of our enemies, and Iran was holding hostages. And basically, we were looking to get our hostages back and create some dialogue with Iran. At the same time, something else was going on in South America, in a country called Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, there was a group of communists in power, okay? And the communists ran Nicaragua, and they also were very mean to their opposition. They wouldn't let people write about them in the newspaper. They wouldn't let people protest things that they thought the government was doing was wrong. They were a very authoritarian regime. Mm-hmm. So the other thing Ronald Reagan did was he promoted democracy, and he wanted people to have the right to vote. One of the things that he did was he was funding Contras. Contras were a group of people in Nicaragua that were fighting the communists. Yeah. Congress was Democrat at the time, and they didn't like that Reagan was funding a group of people that were fighting what they deemed a legitimate government, even though the government was communist. And they basically passed something called the Boland Amendment. You can go read about it, exactly who wrote it and what it dealt with. But basically it said that we couldn't give money to these Contras that were fighting the communists in Nicaragua. So basically what happened was, it was never proven that President Reagan ran the operation and knew everything that was going on. He probably didn't. His people under him ran what was called a clandestine operation, a secret operation. Mm-hmm. Oliver North was the guy that pretty much headed up and planned everything. He's also the guy that got in trouble for everything, one of the guys that got in trouble for everything. Basically what he was doing was, he tried to open up communication with Iran by having Israel sell them weapons. Israel would sell Iran weapons. Iran would get the weapons and pay Israel. Israel would then give the money to the United States to buy arms that they could use for themselves. So they were selling their arms to Iran and then replenishing with the money from America. Okay? And then the profits from those arms sales to Iran, Oliver North used those profits and diverted them to the Contras in Nicaragua so that they could fight the communists. Basically what they did was to set up a capitalistic type of program where, okay, if the Congress says that I can't give you money, I won't give you money. I'll set up a little business over here, and the money that the business makes will fund what I need done. That's basically what happened. Yeah. So they sold arms. They sold arms to Israel, sold arms to Iran. Iran paid Israel for the arms. They bought more arms from the United States that they could use from themselves, sent the profits to the Contras. The Iranians, in turn, released the hostages that they were holding, the American hostages, released them so that they were free to come back to America. And in Nicaragua, the Contras, the Democrats, they overcame the communist regime. They overthrew Daniel Ortega, threw him out of power, and basically were given a government where they could vote for their own leaders. And Reagan, that particular event, that particular period of history called the Iran-Contra scandal, is used by people that oppose Republicans to this day to try to sully Ronald Reagan, to try to make Ronald Reagan look like, oh, he wasn't a great president. He was a great president, and when this all came came to light, the Iran-Contra, and it was a little embarrassing about what happened, he went on TV and he looked the American people in the eye and he apologized. He said, hey, I'm sorry, I take full responsibility. The American people, they forgave him, and to this day, probably Ronald Reagan has 70 to 75% approval rating with people.
Okay, awesome. So, could you give us, like, of all the events that happened in the Iran-Contra, what was the most defining one?
I think the most defining moment was that the communists in Nicaragua got overthrown.
Yeah.
In other words, there was a bunch of people in Nicaragua that were living under a regime that wouldn't give them any freedom, wouldn't give them any rights. And while a lot of people want to look at this and call it a scandal and say what Reagan's people did was illegal, I mean, they put Oliver North in jail for that, okay? Really, at the end of the day, the most important thing that happened was Nicaragua, people were able to go to the polls and vote for their own government. People were allowed to go and protest. And this guy, Daniel Ortega, that was the leader of the communists, instead of getting, like in Iran, they overthrow a government and the religious people took over, they killed people and they marched their dead bodies through the street. Daniel Ortega was let go, and years later, he formed his own political party and got enough votes that he got back into power, elected democratically. And that's the way it's supposed to work. And to me, that was the most defining moment, is that democracy was brought to a small South American country.
Okay, so we have a statement for you made by, well, actually, let's go back to Reagan. So you said that you think that Reagan is one of the, like, Americans' most revered presidents. So you think that he, like, deserves the approval rating?
Yes, I do. He is one of, I would have to say, in my lifetime, he's probably the best president of my lifetime. From, being born in 1963, John Kennedy was alive for maybe 6 months. I was 6 months old when he was killed. John Kennedy is revered mainly because he was assassinated, not because he did many great things, but because he said a lot of great things and was assassinated. I would say of my lifetime, Ronald Reagan was the greatest president.
Okay.
And I think, yes, he deserves the high rating that he gets from the public.
So, to what degree do you think he was involved in the Iran-Contra affair? Like, do you think, like, from, like, a point of heading the operations to just being informed about it? Like, how involved was he?
I think that he had good people working for him that knew deep down what he thought, and they just did it. They carried out to the best of their abilities. And I think maybe Oliver North, maybe some of the other guys went a little too far, and at the end of the day, Ronald Reagan, they couldn't find anything. They investigated him. They had this commission and that commission. They couldn't find anything to convict him of anything. And like I said, he went on TV and he apologized for anything that he might have known and done. He took full responsibility for it because he was in charge, and I thought that was large of him to do that. And there was some handwritten notes that were found by the Defense Secretary, Caspar Weinberger. Caspar Weinberger actually took the notes of a meeting, and Reagan probably knew a little bit more than he let on to know, but one of the things that Reagan felt was that while he could go on TV and maybe explain away and apologize that he let some money get diverted to Nicaragua to help these freedom fighters, and that he let Israel sell arms to Iran to get hostages released, okay, he couldn't face the American public and say, I can't not get these hostages released. Even though it's the Americans' policy to not negotiate with terrorists and not negotiate with hostage takers, he had an opportunity to get those 7 people free that were being held, and he did it.
So, to what degree do you think this was an arms for hostages deal?
To what degree do I think what?
Like that we were giving arms to Iran in return for hostages back.
At the end of the day, that's what it became. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if you break it down to its rawest form, that's what it was. And a lot of it was, they were trying to establish ties with that government, to try to talk to them, to try to make things better. That didn't work. The only thing they really got was Israel sold these guys some arms and we got the hostages released. So really, that's all it was. At the end of the day, in its most raw sense, if you want to break it down, that's what it was. Yes.
So,
but,
is that
like I said, he took responsibility for it.
is that a fair trade in your opinion?
Well, that's an interesting question, and my answer to that would be to the relatives of the 7 hostages that got released, to their loved ones, it was more than a fair trade. And frankly, I think it was a fair trade because the arms that we sold to Iran back in those days, like right now, Iranian arms are being used against our troops in the Middle East to kill American boys and girls. But in those days, in the mid-'80s, those arms were being used to kill Iraqis, to kill Saddam Hussein's army. So, yes, I think it was, at the end of the day, it was the right move to do.
Okay. So when the affair first broke, it was in New York by a New York newspaper that notified the people that the CIA actually had planted mines in a Nicaraguan port, and it was a huge deal at the time. Do you remember this incident, or did you have any initial response to it?
I don't remember the incident, but if you tell me it was a New York newspaper, was it the New York Times?
It was either the Times or the Wall Street Journal.
Okay, well, if it was the New York Times is one of the most liberal, left-leaning newspapers in the history of newspapers. And the New York Times consistently tries to paint anybody that thinks conservatively or on the right as a moron. And that's what they do. That's what they do. So, I think that, I don't remember the incident, but I know that the CIA was involved in this operation because that's what Oliver North was doing. And frankly, that's the CIA's job, is to run secret missions that promote America and America's ideals, and don't promote and actually demote our enemies' ideals. And I think that's what they were doing with the release of the hostages, with the Democrats taking over in Nicaragua from the communists. I think at the end of the day, the ends justify the means.
So is secrecy an essential quality of our government, or do you think that the American government could function more transparently?
I think in Utopia, if you've ever heard of Utopia,
Yeah.
in Utopia, operating transparently is the way, and there should be no secrets. But unfortunately, the other countries aren't playing by the same rules. And as long as the other countries aren't playing by the same rules, you put yourself at a major disadvantage. If you want to be 100% transparent, 100% honest, and do nothing secret and in secret. And that's why the CIA has always been important.
Okay, when the trial broke, there were several major issues that came up regarding law and constitutionality of different actions. Do you think law was broken in this instance?
I think law was broken because people went to jail. There was trials and people went to jail, and so laws were broken. And that's one of the reasons why Ronald Reagan went on TV and apologized and took full responsibility, because laws were broken, people got in trouble, people went to jail. And at the end of his presidency, people were pardoned.
Well, then, what do you think of President Bush? What was your reaction to President Bush pardoning Colonel North and others? Was it just or unjust?
That's a good question. I think that every president has that power to pardon people, and every president pardons people. They all do at the end of their terms. And I think, personally, from my perspective, Oliver North and the things that he did, maybe being covert and secretive, and maybe being borderline illegal, they were things that made the United States a much safer place. And he was convicted and he served some time in jail, and I think that Bush pardoning him was legal and within Bush's rights to do that. And I think he felt that time served by Oliver North was enough for what he did. And I'm going to agree with George Bush on that. And trust me, George H.W. Bush, the first George Bush, or the second George Bush, I did not agree with a lot of what they thought and what they did. They like Ronald Reagan.
So, do you think that it's an American norm or trend to give up rights in order for security?
No, I think we're doing that right now. Every time you go to the airport and you walk through a scanner and you let somebody frisk you for no reason, you're giving up rights. You're giving up rights for your safety. And the fine line is where do we draw that line? And you can't let. The reason why we were attacked on 9/11 was because our enemies used our freedoms against us. The freedom to be able to get in and out of the country across the border, the freedom to be able to not have to show an ID to do what you want to do, to be able to learn how to fly a plane without showing an ID or fill out a form or something, that was used against us. And over 3,000 people were killed. So it's really a fine line, and I don't believe in giving up freedoms for protection. Like a lot of people right now, they're trumpeting, we have the Second Amendment gives me the right to have a gun, the right to have a firearm. And there's a lot of people that think now if we take away the Second Amendment and we're going to save a lot of kids from, having some moron show up at a school and shoot a bunch of people. But I think that's not true. I think that it's a fine line, and you've got to be careful what rights you give up. And I think that whatever laws that were broken under Iran-Contra, people that broke those laws, they paid the price. They went to jail. Even if they were pardoned, they went to jail, and they maybe didn't serve a full term, but they served time in jail, or they had a black mark against their name for the rest of their lives. But I think the ends justified the means. I think going through a scanner at the airport and being frisked, I'm willing to give that up. So that when I sit on the plane and fly to Pittsburgh or fly back to California, and there's not somebody, 6 or 7 people on there with box cutters ready to take over the cockpit and fly me into a skyscraper and kill me. So I'm willing to give up that right. But then there's other rights I'm not willing to give up, and that's the fine line. And that's the problem with the world today when we say, well, should we not do anything secretive, and should we have everything be above board and be able to see through everything, and it would be great to be able to do that. You could see on 9/11, our enemies, they weren't doing it. They weren't doing that, and they used our freedom against us. So we need to be free, and we need to protect our rights, but it's a fine line, and it's really case-by-case basis, and you really need to trust the guy that you have on the top of the totem pole, whether it be Obama, Clinton, Reagan, whoever it is. Got to trust that guy that they're going to do what's right for all of us.
So, to what degree do you think that there was sensationalism in the media at the time of the Iran-Contra affairs? Like, do you think that it maybe influenced public perception of the government actions?
I think that the media, what they did was they created a frenzy that our government had did something worse than what they did. And I think the media does that to this day. They did that to George Bush. I think that the media has ceased being journalists, and now and even then in the mid '80s they were more like cheerleaders, and they cheered their side. And media at that time was cheering people on the left and the Democrats that were out of power, or at least out of executive power, and they were trying to bring Reagan down a notch because he was a very popular guy. And in 1984, he won re-election. He won 49 states. That's how popular that guy was. So, yes, I think that had a lot to do with it. The media they carried an agenda, as they do today. And I think, and I'll tell you something else too, I think your teacher carries an agenda as well. Is this the subject they gave you, or that you picked?
That's the subject that we picked. So we have another question for you.
Yeah. Regarding the Reagan administration, essentially with the affairs in Nicaragua, the government funded a rebellion overseas in the country, and that was mainly headed by the CIA and people in Reagan's administration, solely by the executive branch. How far do you think Reagan expanded the power of the executive, and do you think it was too far by bypassing Congress completely?
No, I don't. I think that he funded insurrection in Nicaragua, yes. But I think that was already set up. It's kind of like, if you look at what happened in Libya recently, it was the same thing. But see, what happened in Libya, Obama was in charge, and the media loves Obama. So they didn't do anything to Obama. They didn't say anything bad about Obama, what Obama did, and he did the same thing. He funded and gave arms and gave air power and air cover to the rebels that were fighting Gaddafi in Libya. And I agree with what Obama did, because Gaddafi was a terrorist, and we needed to get him out of power. And they did that. I think Reagan did the same thing with Nicaragua. He found a group of people that were opposing the communist regime, that were for democracy, that were for voting. And yes, he was funding those people. And he was funding, they called them freedom fighters, and he was funding them. And it was a very popular program with the public. The public approved of that program 75 to 25. But some Democrats in Congress passed an amendment, forced it through, and basically handcuffed Ronald Reagan so that he couldn't just allot money out of his budget to those people down there. So they went around it. They said, okay, we can't give money that's in our budget, so we're just going to have the CIA go over here and set up a clandestine operation where they'll sell arms, and the profit of those arms will go down to these rebels, and they'll still have their money. We didn't want them to starve. They were fighting. They needed arms, they needed food, they needed bullets, and unfortunately, our Congress was trying to choke them off. And I think at the end of the day, Reagan was for freedom, and he was for democracy. And those are important things that sometimes we take for granted. And I hope you guys, when you're all 18, you go vote, because it's a real important right.
So how real do you think the threat of communism was in Nicaragua at the time of the affairs?
No, I don't think it wasn't a threat. It wasn't a mortal threat like Soviet nuclear missiles pointed at New York, loaded up with fuel, ready to go. All somebody had to do was push a button. It wasn't a threat like that, but it was a threat. And the world in those days was a chess game, just as it is today. It's a chess game. The two players were the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was going into different countries and supporting communists into taking power. And in South America, several countries like Cuba, like Nicaragua, like other countries, they went communism because it appeals to the populace when the populace is very poor. Because they think that, okay, everybody's going to share everything, and I'm going to get some of what the rich people have. But all communism does is just keeps everybody poor, but just sets up a different group of people that have stuff. And I think that the threat was not as large as a nuclear missile made at us, but it was a chess game. And we were trying to keep countries democratic instead of being communist. And especially having countries that were communist in our hemisphere, the danger would be, like during the 60s when Kennedy was president, you have a country like Cuba that went communism, that was tight with the Russians. The Russians put nuclear missiles in Cuba pointed at us. And think about how long it would take a nuke to fly from Moscow to Washington, D.C. versus how long it would take for one to fly from Cuba to Washington, D.C. So that was really the conundrum. That was really the threat. The threat was that a regime in Nicaragua that was friendly with the Soviets could put nuclear missiles there and reach the United States shores in a matter of moments instead of 10 or 15 minutes where we might have time to send a jet up there to shoot the missile down.
Okay. So regarding that, the severity of the threat, do you think that the U.S. and Reagan's response by organizing airstrikes in Nicaragua using the CIA and other things was an overreaction, or was it like a justified reaction? Do you think we overreacted because of the communist threat, or that it was justified to stop it from severely impacting U.S. policy?
I think it was justified. And I think the proof in the pudding is that in, I guess it was 1989, the Soviet Empire fell. And you don't see communism today. Well, you see it in Vietnam, you see it in Cuba, but where else do you see it? Because the major machine that was outfitting communism, that was funding communism, was the Soviet Union. And Reagan was in a chess game against them. And Reagan other communist regimes around the world, they folded too. Now the only ones that are left are the ones that China is pulling the strings for, like Vietnam and Korea.
Okay, so do you think that this specific instance, the fall of communism in Nicaragua, do you think that led directly to the fall of the Berlin Wall? Because we've heard from a few sources that it was going that the Soviet Union was going to fall regardless.
No, the Soviet Union would not have fallen regardless. I don't say that the fall of Nicaragua to the democratic forces was the straw that broke the camel's back, but it was one of them. And the reason why the Soviet Union fell is because they got in an arms race with us, and they got in a race of funding communists in this country against us, and the communists in this country against us. And then we went into Nicaragua and we funded our people against them, and we got into basically an arms war with them. And at the end of the day, capitalism wins. Because nobody's going to beat capitalism. That's how we won World War II, was we were the arsenal for democracy. We were able to sit here and build boats and build ships and build weapons and build munitions, and they couldn't do that there. They were busy fighting. And so I think that the chess game that Ronald Reagan played with the Soviets, I think the proof's in the pudding, and he won, and the Berlin Wall fell. And to say, well, the Berlin Wall would have fallen anyway, well, then how come China's still communist? How come Cuba's still communist? If communism inevitably is going to fall because it's such a weak form of government, why is China still a strong communist power? And I can tell you, one of the reasons why they're still a strong communist power is because they kind of morphed a little bit towards capitalism, towards state-controlled capitalism, because they see how strong capitalism is and how much it provides for people. Like in America, look how much stuff we have. Even poor people have a color TV and an iPhone.
Okay, so after all this, what do you think the long-term impact on U.S. policy was, domestic policy and foreign policy was after all these affairs?
Well, the long-term effect was that the United States, under Bill Clinton, had unbridled economic success because we didn't have to worry about the Russians and communism anymore. And it wasn't until really 9/11 when a new threat emerged. I mean, we just rolled along from that point on. We really did. That's what that led to. It led to great economic expansion, and Bill Clinton being revered as a great economic president. That set the tone for him. And he had good policies as well, economic policies that work for welfare and things of that nature. But the fact that he didn't have to gear up and arm himself and be scared of the Soviet, the Soviet communist regime, that really helped us gear towards capitalism and make money for everybody and create jobs and wealth.
Okay, but specifically regarding diplomatic relations, how do you think it impacted the way that the U.S. now deals with foreign nations currently?
I'm thinking about that. I think that for one thing, it's really allowed the media to flex their muscles. And they've really, since that period of time, since they were able to throw a little mud on President Reagan, they've realized how much power they have. And they really went after, while they kept the gloves off and didn't go after Bill Clinton, they really went after the second George Bush really hard. And they really sullied him and his reputation and everything he tried to do. And when he left office, his approval rating was piss poor because he didn't get, part of it was because he made stupid policy decisions, but part of it was because he didn't get any positive coverage on TV or in the media anywhere.
Okay, so not to...
So I think that's probably been the biggest effect in our foreign policy is that the administration, whoever it may be, they have to be really wary of the media.
All right.
They have to be really scared of the media.
Okay, so we've got about 3 questions left or so, and then we're going to wrap it up. So, not to turn our attention away from, the future and Bush and whatnot. But what do you think about North and McFarland and Poindexter and their associates all taking the fall for Reagan? Because what we saw was legally, Reagan left unscathed. Do you think that should have happened, or should he have held some legal responsibility?
I think there was no evidence to convict Ronald Reagan of anything. And if there would have been, they would have gone after him. They were looking for it. They had 3 or 4 or 5 different commissions that they put together and spent millions and millions of dollars looking for something that they could pin on that guy. And they couldn't find anything. And the public loved him because rather than go on TV and look him in the eye, say, I did not have sex with that woman. Monica Lewinsky, I didn't have sex with her. And lie to them, he went on TV and he said, look, I don't really know everything that happened, but I'm the guy in charge. The buck stops here. I take full responsibility. And I think that American public really liked that. And I think had Bill Clinton gone on TV and said that, he would be thought of a lot more highly than he was, than he is. And I think that had there been some evidence to convict Reagan, he would have been convicted. I have no problem that his underlings, they were the ones that took the brunt, as they should. As they should.
Okay, so, do you have any overarching comments for specifically just the affair in this time period?
This is the final question. If you have any leaving comments on the Iran-Contra affair, anything, if you had to say one thing to wrap it up, what would it be?
Okay. I would say to be mistaken.
That's fine.
All right. I would say that the Democratic Congress blocked Ronald Reagan from funding a popular program of funding freedom fighters in Nicaragua who were fighting for the right to vote. Nicaragua was communist. North set up a business selling arms to Iran, who was fighting Saddam Hussein in Iraq, was evil. They gave the profits to the freedom fighters who won their independence from the communists. And the Democrats in the United States Congress were so enraged at Ronald Reagan that his administration was able to go around the curve and get done what they wanted to get done. They basically spent millions and millions and millions of dollars trying to convict him of something that there was no evidence of.
All right. Thank you very much for this interview. It was a lot of good information.
Well, thank you very much for your interest in the subject.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Uncle Andy.
Thanks.
See ya.
See ya.